Okay, I think we are ready to get going. We're gonna hold our CodeCast session number 2 today. We did session 1 about 6 weeks ago, where we covered code updates for Washington State and PNW codes. We are recording today's session to let everyone know. Team's probably told you that already. And today we wanted to kind of open up the sessions a little bit more for some discussion. We are going to cover some technical content, talking about code alternatives and flexible tools that the code gives us. But then we wanted the majority of the time today to be open to questions from the group we have today, as well as kind of panel discussion with the Jensen Hughes experts that we've put on today. And just to start off, I apologize for a little bit of a lisp. I had a little bit of oral surgery done earlier this week. So yeah, apologize for a little bit of a lisp and some swelling I've got going on. So quickly covering the agenda. We're gonna talk a little bit about Jensen Hughes as a company. We'll introduce the panel of experts we have on today. We'll go into our focus topic, like I mentioned, alternative approaches and code flexibility tools. That'll be about 15 minutes, not too long, but we figure it will foster some discussion. For anybody that saw our AIA Seattle Code Mode presentation, we borrowed some content from that. And then the rest of the session will be panel discussion, where we hope to hear from you guys, hear any questions you have, any observations related to code topics. So very quickly, just a little bit about Jensen Hughes. Been around since 1939. Our values are high commitment to our clients, expertise, timely expertise, global reach, yet with a local focus, local presence for the clients that we serve, innovative approaches, and we're really driven by our values, as you can see from this slide here. Most of these are common to all businesses, so certainly compatible with the building industry in general. We provide a pretty broad range of services. Really, our focus is on serving our clients in all aspects of safety, security, and risk. Mostly the content today pertains to the left bubble here, fire and building safety. But we wanted to present the other aspects that we do practice in, general risk and hazard, security, emergency management, forensics, figuring out when something goes wrong, figuring out why it went wrong, as well as a number of software tools that we developed to support our practice. Specific to fire and building safety, here's just a quick list rundown of the primary scope types that we do under the Fire and Building Safety Division, which is the largest division in Jensen Hughes. Company is about 1,500 employees globally. Predominantly, most of our employees are located in the United States, and we've got about 200 employees in the Western region. So yeah, definitely a strong team and a range of specific practices that our group does. Finally, just wanted to touch on kind of the code development role that we play. We're very involved with a number of code organizations. Really, the top 3 on this list are really the big ones, particularly for the content that we're going to talk about today. ICC, Code Development Involvement, Society of Fire Protection Engineers, and the National Fire Protection Association. We're also very involved at the state level. We're currently sitting on advisory groups for state of Washington and state of Oregon in working through their adoption of the next cycle of codes, the 2024 International Code Basis, and bringing that into our Pacific Northwest states. So yeah, real quickly, I'll introduce the panel we have today. We've got primarily 8 members from Jensen Hughes here today, kind of representing certainly our Pacific Northwest group, as well as a range of engineering and architectural focus. So we can talk a bit more about the individuals once we get to the open Q&A session. But with all that out of the way, we'll hop into the focus topic that we want to talk about today. So yeah, I'll tee it up here, and then Andy Leanto will be talking through the few additional slides content that we have. But sort of starting it off, um, the role of a code consultant. um, a building code consultant is there to really assist a project team during the design and construction process for a project. The level of involvement that we have really ranges based on client preference, um, and really sophistication of the project. Sorry about that. But in general, we're reviewing designs and concepts, providing input to really support early decision making. Certainly, it's never good if a project goes through the bulk of design or all of design and then finds out during permit review that there's major challenges to work out. So we try to identify those as early in design as possible, so that designs can be tailored to it while they're being shaped up and detailed. So yeah, a huge part of our role is identifying those life safety, fire protection challenges to code compliance, and determining if there's alternate approaches that are warranted for a project. If a concept is very important to a project vision, then we're going to want to find out whether there are alternative approaches that we could justify that would allow that project vision. And so we're also there to negotiate through the negotiation process with the HJ, and going through that issue that's been identified proactively to determine if they will accept the alternative that's being proposed. So yeah, with that said, we like to be involved very early in projects, so that we're not identifying things that are painful for the design team um, to correct or change about the design. We like to be involved at that concept or schematic level to identify any major challenges there. And we are also often brought in for specific issues that have been identified by others. Usually it's kind of an 11th hour scenario. We have an issue, need to find a solution. We're certainly brought on in that capacity. It can limit the options and the time that we have available to find a solution. But certainly we thrive in that type of atmosphere as well. So yeah, I'll turn it over to Andy to walk through the rest of our content.
Thank you, Walker. Let me see. So the building code, or IPC in this case, provides some provisions that would allow for flexibility, and we'll discuss some of these definitions or understanding for each of these items in the next slides. But just wanted to itemize these provisions here. Code interpretation is one way. It's outlined in Chapter 1 of the IPC. Engineering judgment is another option to address or provide this flexibility that the code recognizes. Modification, or sometimes it's called code modification. And the last item is alternative materials design and methods of construction and equipment, or it is sometimes shortened by calling it code alternates. And some of the related topics that we could mention briefly related to performance-based design and third-party review. These are related to some of the performance-based design are sometimes used to justify one of the options that were used for doing modification or code alternates, and third-party review is sometimes employed by the jurisdiction to assist with some of the review for some of the complex code modifications or code alternates. Next slide, please. So code interpretation interpretation of code requirements is often necessary for application to a project-specific or unique design situation, but must be consistent with the code intent. The definitions can be important to understanding and interpreting code intent. There are many sources that provide insight and interpretation of code requirements. The model code, standard organizations like ICC and NFPA provide formal or informal code interpretations for base code IPC requirements. Each jurisdiction may provide standard or formal interpretations that can be posted in the website, and that fall under a variety of names, such as code interpretation or administrative bulletins, client's assistant memo, director's rules, and so on and so forth. Some ASJs also provide additional guidance that expand or clarify the code requirements, either formally or informally. Code interpretation may be proposed by a project team or a code consultant in the form of engineering opinions, but the ultimate decision is rendered by the authorities having jurisdictions, and they must agree or disagree and provide the final interpretation on a specific code requirement. IPC section 104.1 outlines or give the mandate for the building official to provide this code interpretation. Next slide. So engineering judgment, or sometimes it's shortened by EJ, is typically applied when a specific or tested assembly is going to be modified or combined with other listings. IPC section 703.2.2 item 4 provides the basis that would allow engineering judgment to be applied to address a certain fire resistance rating of an assembly. EJ justification methods or resources could include the actual specific listing of a tested assembly coming from the UL, Intertech, or other nationally recognized testing laboratories. Manufacturer resources such as the National Gypsum Purple Book or Gypsum Association Fire Resistance Manual or American Wood Council reports are sometimes used by code consultants to justify the EJ proposal. Harmafi's rule is also used to address some of the changes related to the fire resistance rating of an assembly. And yeah, down there at the bottom, we included the code specific code section that would allow the analytical methods to address a fire resistance rating of an assembly. The next slide, please. So code modifications and code alternates, it's important to discuss these at the same time. That's why we're putting it side by side there, but there are subtle differences between the two. I'm not going to read each word, but it's important to highlight some of the main differences between the two provisions here. So code modifications, in order for a proponent or design team to apply for code modifications, they have to demonstrate that there is a practical difficulty to achieve a specific code requirement. And that talks about the impracticality of providing certain design requirements or code requirements. And the proponent has to demonstrate that what they're proposing, and it could be a combination of different aspects of the building design, and the solution has to meet the minimum intent of that specific code requirements, right? On the flip side, the code alternate or alternative materials design and construction, it relies on providing an alternate method or alternate design option um, that would provide an equivalent level to um, what the code requirements requires. So typically, code modifications has a lower bar to achieve because the proponent has to provide or show or demonstrate that the solution meets the code intent. But a code alternate typically could present a higher bar that the alternate options or alternate design has to meet an equivalent level of what the code requirement is required to achieve. Next slide. So note on terms. So jurisdictions may use different terms to refer to some of these provisions that the code allow for flexibility. In some cases, this is intended and covered by adopted amendments to the model code or state building code.
How exciting is that, huh?
Um,
Who is this? My name is.
So ASG references may not match the terms that we've discussed, while some authorities are very specific on categorizing the different provisions that we talked about. So some ASG, for example, they may call both code modifications and code alternates as AMMR, which stands for alternate means and methods of request. But some jurisdictions, for example, City of Seattle or City of Bellevue, they would like to specifically call the proposal or the provision to be either code modification or code alternate, and the design team has to decide on what they're trying to achieve in that case. So this is one reason that early discussion with the authority is very important, so that that would provide an efficient and successful process and establish the common goal and common references, common terms before the formal code modification or alternate is submitted. A variance is also used in some cases to as a reference to all flexible options. Technically, a variance means a variance or exception from a code requirement, which is not permitted under IPC. Another term which we sometimes hear, equivalency, is also a catch-all term that would that could mean code modification or code alternates as well. Some jurisdictions also calls for an appeal. Appeal could mean something different based on the base IPC requirement, but some jurisdictions would call that to mean either code modification or code alternate as well. So use the term that the authority prefers to avoid any unnecessary barriers during the communication. Definitely, it is necessary to clarify that and document that separately to address any professional concerns that given jurisdiction would require in the process. Next slide. So yeah, this is just to recap that early communication with the authority is very essential to understand what they're willing to achieve and what their level of comfort to address a specific code requirement. Conceptual or design brief submittal is sometimes essential for certain type of justification, especially when we're dealing with a performance-based design. Regular discussion should occur as a code modification or alternate is developed and assessed and is documented, sometimes it is important to discuss a draft code modification once the design team has come up with the items or the justification to make sure that it is aligned with the intent that the code official requires. Jurisdictions may have standard interpretations or modification that can be used as a starting point or reduce any process for a given challenge. The authority may provide early input or guidance as well during the early meeting with the authority, and that could sometimes be helpful to help the design team move into a specific direction. So yeah, with that, I think that's concluding our discussions or our presentation on alternate methods or approaches in within the code. And next slide, and next, for the rest of the presentation, we're just opening up to the group here to see if anybody would have any questions or would like to share any experiences in developing or preparing any code alternates or code modifications, or even if there's any question from the materials that we presented before in CodeCast 1.
So Jane has a question.
Yep.
In the comments.
Yeah, I saw it a moment ago, Samir, but now it's not there. I don't know, but I think it was, I'll just flip back a few slides. I think the question was on getting agreement from the AHJ on the difference between impracticality versus an alternative. Is that?
Yeah, I think how do you determine what is impractical? And I can add to it. You go ahead.
Great, thanks, Samir. Oh, go ahead.
So, Jen, an example I can give you is if you have a existing building and your building floor level is not aligned with the exterior sidewalk, and now you have to do a stair that is not using the rise and run, or your ramp that is not meeting it, that's impracticality. One of the things that we have done with is in the requirement for floor loading for assembly is 100 pounds per square foot versus the office is lower. And when a floor level is changing, the lower floor might be occupied. It might be difficult to go in and make improvements to the floor structure below, and that is an impracticality as well. So on that one, the degree of difficulty gets a judgment. On the first example I gave you, where the floor level is different and structure is there and the floor is not matching, that's very clear that, hey, this is not something that we can bridge directly. So that's the kind of difference between what is clear difficulty and what is a somewhat grayer difficulty. If you have a specific project example where you had a difficulty, we can talk about that as well, Jane. But some of the things is this code has purposefully left it a little bit gray to allow the building official to make a unique decision based on the unique project. It's not the intent of the code is not to make this as a standard that applies to all buildings.
Thanks, Samir. Does that help, Jane? I mean, certainly a gray and interpretive area of whether something's practically difficult or impractical, right? It's very subjective.
It depends on the HJ and how collaborative or conservative they are in interpretation, and what, I didn't know if there was any kind of financial or other ways of identifying. I doubt there's a financial limit on the impracticality of a solution that they may continue to push for.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Actually, we generally will steer clear of financial justifications because, in the eyes of a building or a fire official, the financial challenges that it'll put on a project is rarely a consideration that they'll really entertain, unless it's, of course, a huge cost.
And the code has given some of those guidelines, Jane. You're probably referring to the significant changes on structural aspect for existing buildings. There is 25%, there is 50% of building impact, things like that. but it's often not brought into these kind of discussions. But they're not the code. The code says cost is not an issue. Even in the ICC, when the code development is going on, cost is a consideration. The intent is not to put on a burden on the economic development of the regions and find solutions that are matchable. So what we typically do on the cost is include cost as a softer issue and include the difficulty of actually achieving that as having to move an entity out or move an entity in, having to move existing structural capacity being a limit. So we emphasize on the non-cost issues, but underlying cost, the jurisdiction knows why you're coming there.
And that being said, if we're talking about existing buildings where there are other factors at play and there is a future planned renovation, then that could be a talking point with the AHJ. If there's a phasing plan for the next 5 to 10 years to get through compliance for more existing projects, but for new construction, there's a lot less leniency on pricing.
That's a very good point. That's a very good point. Yeah.
This is definitely renovation situations where you're just up against zero lot lines or anything else, and they're trying to make modifications to comply to current code, which it's just impractical. But we can't seem to get past. We can't seem to get past a series of questions that are impractical from the AHJ.
Also, less commonly, sometimes there are political motivations for being a little bit more lenient on a project. That's infrequent. And it's not something to certainly bank on. But if you're doing a project, for example, that serves the public good, volunteer organizations, that kind of thing, sometimes while you may not necessarily be able to plead cost as an exclusive factor for why you can't do something, you might get a little bit of leeway on that. That generally tends to be outside the process and involves a little bit more conversation with other people. But we have, on rare occasion, gotten a little bit of relief with that respect.
And Jay, let's talk separately as well. Sometimes because we don't have a stake in the design, and we come in as a neutral third party and and respected for our expertise, we're able to negotiate the jurisdiction that you may not be able to.
Yeah, and also, the light and perspective that you bring something to them and also can be critical. And we try to pay attention to those nuances for a given situation.
But good question, generated a lot of comments.
Yeah, appreciate the question. And if anybody else has any other questions, that's exactly what we want to do today, is really have open discussion based on the interest of the group.
So Walker, we had another question come in from Jonathan Wood. His question is, can the AHJ create something like a memorandum of understanding for properties that will require a common code alternate solution across multiple permits or tenancies within the same existing building? So Jonathan, I can speak to this since I have lived in a few different jurisdictions, and they treat these kinds of conditions a little bit differently. So it's really going to depend on where the building is, and that might be what city it's in and or what state it's in. So some states will actually have a variance process that code variance is tied to that property address for the life of the building. Other jurisdictions, it's going to be project to project, tenant to tenant. So this is where knowing what the jurisdiction's expectations and policies are really come into play with how you approach those alternates and what type of language you include in the alternates, because we would want to cover our bases on, are you talking about this as a interim measure to go for the life of that project, or are we talking about something that needs to be formally filed with a actual building official jurisdiction and be for the life of the building? So the answer to your question is really, it depends, because each jurisdiction treats these conditions a little bit differently.
Let me take that as well. So, Jonathan, the word you use, memorandum of understanding. So that's one more legal document that we use in negotiation. It has a different weightage than an alternate or a code modification. So an alternate and code modification becomes permanent code for the life of the building or entity. Memorandum of understandings are a little bit looser and can go across multiple buildings and things like that. We commonly find that as memorandum of understanding more used in code interpretations across multiple buildings on one campus owned by one entity. And so there's an agreement. And in those instances, similar to an M&M, but the understanding is that we know the entity who's going to own the buildings. We know the jurisdiction who's serving the buildings, and we know each other's capabilities, each other's philosophies and things, and therefore we can feel comfortable doing this. So it tends to be more specific to owner, not just a building. The owner goes away, then it gets either renegotiated or extended beyond. So it's a legal entity, but going beyond that. And part of it is once you go on the performance code or an alternate to a code, you're stepping outside the lines, and then it leaves the jurisdiction and ability to ask for something that is beyond the code. So it becomes a negotiation. So it could be at that point a negotiation about something like a memorandum of understanding that you agree to and sign on to as part of the solution, that approval or relief that you're getting.
Yeah, great feedback, Samir. And I've got a really pertinent example. I worked with a very large airport for about a decade, and it started out with a memorandum of understanding for how we were going to regulate new terminal buildings at that airport, because they would nest into obviously the existing terminal buildings that the airport had already. And then that evolved into a standard modification that was applicable to every one of the existing terminals. And it was addressing some, legacy application issues that the building and fire department had concerns over. And it was also addressing some challenges of working with the building and fire department, some concerns that the airport authority had. But we ended up with this template modification that the next major project in each of those terminals used to apply this criteria to each of the terminals. And so the airport authority got a lot of consistency from existing building to existing terminal building. They got a clear way to regulate new buildings. And the building and fire department were happy because everything was documented and everything was consistent. Yeah, that's one example of where, on a very large scale, these alternative vehicles can be used to really smooth the process of development and construction.
Jonathan, did that answer your question, or did you have additional context you wanted to share?
Oh, no, that was a very good answer, very helpful, specifically the context of Seattle. And that's all I can really say about it. and actually, the memorandum of understanding, I would say, the reason I asked about that is this is something that may not be needed if current code interpretations that are held by the building official were changed. And in the event that those change, then there's less of an issue that would need to be resolved by some understanding, because you could get there through the standard application of the code. So that's why I asked the question. Thank you.
That's a very good.
Thank you.
That's a very good point, Jonathan. I actually have gone back and deleted code alternates that applied to a building after a code change took place. So because sometimes a code alternate has some specific requirements that apply, but a new code change might permit what you were trying to do in the first place. So I've gone back and deleted alternate is no longer applicable. So that's a formal process.
Yeah, I think there's another application too, is that frequently many different architecture firms may arrive at the same problem that needs a solution. And then when you go in during your submittal process, it's actually quite difficult to renegotiate for every single project that each architect is dealing with whether or not some solution is applicable to their project with their particular constraints, even though, if you were to take a 30,000 foot look at it, everyone's dealing with the same thing. So if there was some vehicle, maybe it's a variance that runs with the property that, if that were clearly available to architects serving their clients, that they could reference that as a part of their building permit submittal, that would be great. Many times the plans examiner is not necessarily going to volunteer that there is a variance that was allowed or an alternate that was allowed or is some template. But I do really like the examples. That's quite helpful. Thank you.
And actually, on that one, I actually encourage clients to even put down agreements with plan reviewers in your code summary sheet. We're working on a client where we are doing some agreements about occupant load factors and whether it's an office or an assembly in Seattle, so that we don't have to trigger the higher structural load issue. And we went with the city, got an agreement, and I asked the architect to put that on the code sheet as a note that per this meeting, per this agreement with this plan reviewer, we are agreeing to follow this process. Because it then remains on the drawing for posterity. The letters that you write and memos that you write, nobody finds them. Code sheets, they stay there.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you, Samir.
Yeah, meeting minutes, alternates, engineering judgments, those should all be on drawing sheets. We all know that anything smaller than 32 by 40 just evaporates in about 3 months after the project is completed. Not sure why that's the case, but I'm sure we all know it's the case.
Okay, great discussion. We do have another question that came in from Jane Barker. So her question is, how do you get an agreement with the AHJ on what conditions are practical difficulties and what do you use as... Oh,
Yeah, that
what?
was the first one. We talked over that one. That was the first one we covered.
Did it? Oh, I think it went backwards in time there. Sorry.
Oh, okay. No problem. I think
Are there other questions?
Yeah. Anybody have certainly speak up if you have a question. I think everyone is able to unmute, but certainly the chat or the Q&A function works as well.
If nobody else is speaking, I'll ask another question.
Great.
Who has authority over the building official? And so if you are to actually challenge the building official's interpretation, they have the right to make that interpretation. If you're to challenge it, who handles that challenge or adjudicates, the challenge? So
that's typically going to be the state code body. So for state of Washington, it would be the SBCC, the State Building Code Council.
In general, in your knowledge, is that a rare event or does that happen fairly commonly?
No, it depends on the jurisdiction and depends on how much time you have. In Portland, the big board is on top of the building official, and there's an established process that you go through that to challenge the building official.
Yes.
In Oregon, the state BCD can do it, but it takes more time to do that. We have gone through the state BCD on some instances for that as well, and do that. California has a state architect.
Yeah, I missed a step. Yeah, usually the city will have an appeals board that would be able to overrule the building official. Thanks, Mayor. Go ahead.
And then California has a state architect, but it's a very process-driven and very long drawn in. So it sometimes it's who has the authority, and sometimes is it the right solution for you. So
right.
So yeah. So it's a lot of strategies involved, not just legal. Put your head down and ram after the official, because part of it is you're also this is not your only building, right? As an architect, you're going to work with them over time. So that also comes into play. And so strategy in some instances I'm not trying to plug myself, but strategy in some instances might be getting a code consultant to do the dirty work for you, then you're doing it, right? So we play tag team with architects and say, you do this, I do this. In the end, we're all in the business of providing a safe solution, right? And sometimes perspectives and frameworks differ, not where our heart is. And if something is wrong, we will not mess with it. We'll tell you it's wrong, don't do it. But if it's a difference of opinion, we'll work strategy and get it. I've sometimes gone to saying, hey, you get a lawyer for this one. Let the lawyer write a letter and we'll work on this side. So sometimes the strategy is much more complex on getting the results. But we first have to understand we all want the same results. I had a discussion with an architect and said, we're wanting to do this. Our occupant load is this. Our client doesn't want to do it. I said, leave aside the client. I want to talk to you as the architect. You're stamping the drawing. Are you comfortable saying this is not going to be the occupant load based on what you're designing and everything? And they kind of looked at me and said, but this is what we want to do. No, you as the architect is the professional. You are in charge. You tell me, I'll work towards that. If you're not sure, we shouldn't be doing this. So it kind of comes down to our ethics and our values and what are we trying to do for the community also. That makes sense?
Truly. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
I would add that depending on the jurisdiction, even if you file an appeal and go to the state board or the state fire marshal or division state architect, whoever, the jurisdiction still has the authority to say, that's fine, but I don't agree. And you still need to comply with whatever their requirements are in their jurisdiction. So it can come back that you take all this time and spend all this effort and they say, great, we don't agree. So that's something to consider as well, depending on the jurisdiction, the relationship, the project, other ongoing projects like Samir mentioned as well.
That is very interesting about the U.S. That it's not a federal system. That many other countries we work with, and we are a global entity, right? And work with, and they were saying like, you don't have a national code, so there's no one entity that governs everything. So we don't have that system. I was just having a discussion on a legal issue with a company in South Korea, and they say, well, what about this company and this company? Why don't you give me a national certificate that says these two companies are one and the same? We don't have a national certificate. I can't give you that. So some of the things that make us so unique also create challenges for how we are structured in terms of authority.
Another thing that's interesting, is a little bit off track, but hadn't been mentioned in the earlier discussion, is something else to keep in mind when you're doing alternates is that AHJs often have different attitudes towards filing those in the first place. Some AHJs, particularly in small jurisdictions, if your project isn't huge and you're not doing something complicated, are very happy to work with you to accept accept an alternate that you filed without too much trouble. There are other jurisdictions that are much more conservative, and they may be uncomfortable with alternates because they don't like the idea of setting a precedent, or at least they're more cautious because once they approve that alternate, other people are going to rush in and say, hey, we saw this in your alternate database. We want to do this too. And that can open up a huge can of worms. And then you've got jurisdictions that go even further, and I've got some experience with this with Hillsborough, where they don't like doing alternates at all. I prefer to avoid them at all costs, but they will work with you, even if it's contorted, to try to find a path that works within the framework of the code. I actually had a really great experience getting gender neutral bathrooms approved in Hillsborough before the code language had been expanded in the most recent code cycle. And then, of course, the new one is even better. And in that one, it was interesting because the code official had an extremely detailed and nuanced knowledge of the code and where it was coming from and what all of our different options were. And rather than filing an alternate, actually helped us create a code path that justified what we were trying to do. So that is one thing to keep in mind is that, depending on the flavor of the jurisdiction you're dealing with, alternates may be a walk in the park, or they may be a more complicated process.
Which is a major reason that we recommend that early discussion. Yeah, great points and context, Paul and Maddie. Just knowing the attitude of the jurisdiction you're working with toward alternates, engineering judgments early on can really influence the decisions that you make. Some HJs, do not want alternates, but they will, like Paul said, they'll help to take a creative perspective on how something complies with the code, but they don't want to call it an alternate or a modification. So if you don't get that answer up front and you start drafting something, you start analyzing something, you start presenting an argument for why something is equivalent, you've already started off on a bad foot because you never gave them a chance to tell you, we really don't want any documentation that says code alternate.
Yeah. In the case of Hillsborough, their attitude is they don't believe that they have the authority to modify the code or make changes to the code. So when it comes to alternates, they avoid them as much as possible because they're not comfortable with just the idea of saying, hey, we'll allow this change from what the code clearly dictates.
Yeah, and to that point, Paul, so in those cases, we may consider those to be letters of prescriptive code compliance, and that is how we would frame it and the type of language we would use in it, where we are outlining how the intent of the code is being met with the condition, even if it's not as black and white as the language in the code is stating. So that's a different approach that we can take with some of these jurisdictions who may be a little bit more risk averse to accepting a code alternate or an engineering judgment. Did anyone else have other questions about just anything with either updates to the code cycle or alternates, engineering judgments, etc.?
Yeah, code development questions, really anything related to building and fire code. I'm prepared to touch on today.
I don't have a question specific to alternates and modifications, but I'm kind of wondering if you're seeing anything from the pandemic and any influences in the building codes with remote working and kind of workplace in general, a reduction of occupant load in general for commercial buildings. And I was wondering, because a lot of our clients want assembly, and yet that kind of gets skewed with the lack of kind of remote working, with the remote working, the occupant loads and plumbing counts as well, that are being driven by occupant loads. So I was just kind of curious to see if there was anything kind of discussion about codes and occupant load and assemblies kind of coming out from the pandemic.
I think in general, the code development attitude is that the pandemic's effects are temporary. So I think in general, code development is not looking at very many changes in response to the experiences we've had in the pandemic. However, for healthcare facilities, obviously there's been a lot of lessons learned. Those aren't directly code changes, however.
And we've already had some changes in the recent past before the pandemic that actually recognized changes in the workplace, like the fact that things are shifting more towards technology and people are not stacking on top of each other in cubicles quite to the same extent anymore. The occupant load change from 100 to 150 acknowledged that, decreasing density in office spaces. I believe the provisions for small assembly also gave some relief to offices where if you have a small conference room that's less than 750 or less than 49, you can count it as a B occupancy. So already there have been some concessions or some lightening of those kinds of things. So I'd be surprised if they were to introduce further ones. And like Walker said, they're temporary. These are temporary, or at least still dynamic conditions, I think.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, and yeah, I think that decreased density in office environments, I think that's certainly one that parallels, where we're at with workplace density. but that had been an initiative for decades, really, that the old 1 to 100 square foot factor was a higher density than typical office environments are overall. But it was timely that finally got reduced. Go ahead, Maddie.
Oh, sorry, Walker. I didn't realize you were done.
Oh, you're
Sorry
good.
about that. One thing that we've had success with is working with the jurisdictions to develop occupant load factors that are practical to the intended layout. A lot of times, we have a lot of tech in Northern California, and a lot of times what we're finding is that the occupant loads that are actually expected are too dense to be considered a typical 1 to 150 occupant load factor, but they're realistically not dense enough to be considered like a call center 1 to 50 occupant load factor. So identifying seat counts and expected occupant loads for those areas has been really helpful to help the jurisdictions approve occupant loads that are realistic rather than what the code identifies, so that we can basically build the building the way it's intended to be used. That being said, they still want to see the assembly load factors applied to the conference rooms or any meeting spaces or presentation areas, stuff like that. So we're still looking at those spaces with a 1 to 15 or 1 to 7 or whatever those spaces are designed to accommodate. But in our office areas, we've been able to get a little bit more flexibility. That being said,
Okay.
like,
I was
sorry,
going to
one
ask,
second.
have you had success with that in the Northwest?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, on multiple projects actually. And I was just going to jump in, but I didn't want to cut out Maddie. But Maddie, finish your thought, and I'll jump in.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, just the one caveat that I'll add is the kind of field of dreams paradigm of if you build it, they will come, right? So the jurisdiction, if they're seeing you load that space up with desks and you say, oh, there's remote work, so it's only going to be 20% occupied, why do you have so many desks? And they're going to want egress capacity, plumbing fixtures, et cetera, for that worst case scenario when everybody's in that office. And that's been my experience, at least.
So yeah, I've had multiple successes in multiple jurisdictions in the Northwest on this one. And one of the first things is to not use the word assembly. Find the right words. So the right words to describe the spaces, workspaces, collaborative spaces, or work collaboration or lab space rather than conference room. And so using the right terms so your term conveys the activity is important. And one instance we actually had, the client had developed a very informal work session, that workspace that was kind of a terrace workspace, and it was automatically designated assembly. We actually had them bring their work with their interior layouts. The interior layouts on the plans that were submitted were just generic, shows like a lounge. Don't show a lounge if it's not intended to be a lounge. Develop the space and show me the 3D that looks like. They did that, and the jury said, yeah, that looks like an office to us. So the presentation matters in having and what you get there.
Yes, Samir, to that point, a lot of times in tech, we see these huddle rooms, which have like 4 chairs in them, a big table. And if you were to use 1 to 15 occupant load factor, you'd end up with like 11 people in these rooms. But realistically, you really can't fit any more than those 4 chairs in that room. So working with the jurisdiction to do similarly, like show the furniture layout, like Samir's saying, and identify what the actual intended use of that space is going to be.
Another thing to keep in mind with those assembly spaces is that you can utilize fixed objects and fixed furniture in the spaces to decrease what area you are calculating your occupant load based on. So you can do this both interior and exterior, where we see this a lot on like patios and things, where we can actually count those fixed garden boxes and benches and things like that as takeouts from your area. So there are a few different options that you can use in getting a little bit more creative about how you are calculating those loads within reason and within the intent of the code.
One recent experience I had on the benches, Ellie, was that so there is a requirement in the chapter 10, and I think it's 1004, for
bench occupant load factors. So if you're trying to exclude those from your gross, or not your gross, your net floor area for your assembly use, the jurisdiction might come back and have you add in those bench occupants anyway.
As fixed seating, you mean?
Yes. Yeah, one
Yeah,
person to
right.
18 inches of.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That we've gotten
And
around
still
that by
include the
actually
floor area,
making
right?
Yes, both.
we've gotten around that by making those benches into out of essentially loose furniture. So it's essentially a bench. It's not affixed to the floor. And we have, we treat that as furniture, not as a built-in fixed bench. And they've accepted that. That's been nice. So.
Yeah, for sure. More to Ellie's point, if you're trying to exclude the benches for your occupant load factor, those some jurisdictions require those benches to be calculated one way or another. So whether you're including that in your
right.
net floor
That's right.
area or if you're assigning them a specific occupant load.
That's right.
And I've had some on both. All square footage on the floor that's exposed has to be counted, and your 1 per 18 inches of bench. Conversely, I've had jurisdictions where if a table is being fixed to the floor in a conference room, we've even not counted the area below the table because it is a fixed millwork type of element. And that led to pretty realistic occupant loads for that.
Well, it looks like we are at time right now, but if anyone has a last question and wants to hang on, then I think a few of us could stay on for a few extra minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. Open to any last items, or if not, we'll wrap up for today.
And Corey Robinson has put her email address in the chat. So if you have any follow-ups that you want to reach out to any of the people on this panel, you can go through Corey and she will connect you with anyone on our team based on what issue you're running into or what type of topic you need to discuss further.
And just to follow on, our intent is to hold these codecasts about every 6 to 8 weeks. So we will be getting the topic and invite out for the next one in the next few weeks. Got some good input on codecast number 1 for future topics, so we are tracking those. But yeah, similarly, if you have any ideas or things that you think would be interesting for the group that we're getting here, please message those to Corey as well.